Halfway lift, or ardha uttanasana in Sanskrit, is a transitional posture where you inhale and lengthen the spine before moving to a different posture. You'll encounter halfway lifts most commonly in Sun Salutations, but because I'm a trained Ashtanga yoga instructor, you might also hear me cueing them to transition in and out of standing poses like Padangustasana. I'm Morgan. I'm an educator turned yoga instructor here to break down all things yoga and fitness in a way that makes sense to you. If you have any questions, drop them in the comments, and don't forget to like this video and share it with a friend who might find it helpful. Down. Stay. Because halfway lift is a transitional pose that usually only happens for one breath, many students don't study it formally. As a result, sometimes we get bad habits in this pose. In this video, I will give you 4 tips to get a solid halfway lift regardless of your experience or mobility level. This tutorial is part of my Everything You Need to Know About Sun Salutations playlist. Feel free to head over there for other yoga posture deep dives. You want this? What a good girl! Before we dive deep into tips for halfway lift, let's just really establish what it is and where you find it. The first and most common place that you'll find a halfway lift is in a sun salutation. Here is an example of what that looks like. Inhale, send the arms up. Exhale, bow forward and down. Inhale, lengthen the spine, lift halfway. Exhale, step the feet back. Bend the elbows, Chaturanga. Another place you might find a halfway lift in my teaching is transitioning between poses like Padangustasana and Padangustasana. So here's what that looks like, just in case you're curious. Take the hands to the hips, hop the feet hip-width distance apart. Inhale, gaze up, elbows back. Exhale, bow forward and down. Index finger and middle finger between the big toe and second toe, thumb on the inside. Inhale, lengthen the spine, lift halfway, and then exhale, fold deeply here. Padangustasana. Padan foot, gusta finger, asana posture. So foot to finger pose. And then while you're here, a bend in the knees is fine. Rib cage touches the thighs. Weight is in the balls of the feet. Press down through the feet and then start to press down energetically through the fingers, the knuckles. And then to transition out, inhale, lengthen the spine, lift halfway. Exhale, take the hands to the hips, stay right here. Squeezing the legs and the core, inhale, rise all the way up, and then exhale, step the feet together, samastitihi, at attention. So now onto our 4 tips. First tip is that you want an anterior rather than posterior tilt in the pelvis. So what does that mean? Anterior, think Beyonce. Posterior, think Elvis. That's how I remember. We want an anterior tilt in the pelvis when we halfway lift. So I'll just give an example with my spine parallel to the floor. Stay tuned for tip number 3, where we'll talk about what the spine really is doing in relation to the floor. So anterior tilt rather than posterior tilt. This is posterior when I'm bending over. And then this is a little more anterior. It's like neutral going towards anterior as I go here. Now, why is this important? Well, you have to think about how the back muscles work. If you curve the back this way, you're pulling on the muscles in the back. So there's a lot of giant muscles in the low back that attach in the hips, and then there's the muscles in the back of the legs that also attach in the hips. So specifically in the low back, I'm not going to name everything, but we have things like the QL, we have things like the psoas, the erectus spinaea, and these muscles insert in your hips. The psoas is probably the most significant of those, although we shouldn't really have a significant muscle contest because they are all important, right? But if you're giving extra tug on those muscles, especially if you're maybe a person with shorter muscles, you can strain your back, especially over time. So that's one reason why that's important. So what can you do instead? Well, the most important thing, if it's difficult to even come here, which especially if you're an athlete, that could be the case, and I can make a whole nother YouTube video about how strong muscles are oftentimes a little bit less They might have a smaller range of motion. The quick fix, if it's difficult to achieve that anterior tilt in the pelvis, if you find that this is happening, which is something I see a lot in classes that I teach, the trick is to bend your knees so that you have room to tilt the pelvis anteriorly, protecting your muscles so that you don't strain your back. And that's applicable for people, again, with maybe shorter muscles, particularly in the low back and the legs. Tends to either be people who, some of us sit at computers all day long. You all would be candidates for that, as well as like high performance athletes can also be candidates for that. So the point is, don't be too hard on yourself. You're perfect just how you are. Second tip, draw the shoulder blades together behind you to sort of open the chest. That's just this shoulder retraction kind of motion. And that's just to kind of continue on with the idea of that anterior tilt in the pelvis. So we're starting by taking the spine this way, and then to continue that motion, rather than rounding the upper back, we're going to energetically draw the shoulder blades together, retracting the shoulders. So that just continues the same chain, the same movement up the spine from the tailbone all the way up into the cervical spine. Not included in the tip is just being able to look forward slightly. You could look straight down at the floor, or you could start to raise your gaze slightly forward, as long as you don't feel like you're cranking your neck. The third tip that I have for halfway lift, and I think that this one is probably the most misunderstood, is that the spine can be parallel to the floor, but it doesn't have to be. I think the misconception with the spine being parallel to the floor is that that's exactly the halfway point, right, between upright and completely folded forward. And so lifting halfway would be that exact halfway point or parallel to the floor. However, halfway lift does not necessarily mean parallel to the floor. It can be a range of locations. So let me show you what the options are. So far in my demonstrations, it has been parallel to the floor. So I'm taking my hands, I'm putting them on my knees, I could put them down on my shins, and I'm pressing my hands into my surface here, which in this case is my shins, to sort of really have this activation where I'm retracting the shoulders, tilting the pelvis anteriorly. All right, but there's a whole range here. So I'm gonna bend my knees a lot because my hamstrings are feeling nice and short today. And that's fine. So my knees are bent, my rib cage is touching my thighs, my hands are flat on the floor. I'm gonna work to anteriorly tilt my pelvis and retract my shoulders as much as possible here. So it's not this, right? I'm not doing like a bend. I'm really lengthening the spine forward. So hopefully you can see the difference. I'm not the biggest example of lower body mobility over here. So that might be a good thing, a good learning opportunity for all of us. So this is a halfway lift. And this is in particular a halfway lift in a really vigorous practice like Ashtanga, where you're going to float back into your chaturangas, because you want to be able to really have this connection with the floor. Inhale, lengthen the spine, lift halfway, and then exhale, chaturanga dandasana. Maybe I lift up into a handstand, maybe I float the feet back to my low push-up position or my chaturanga position. So that would be a reason to be planting the hands down, is to prepare for that. You can use all manner of props. So these are my cork yoga blocks from Manduka. These are a different size. They're a little skinnier both ways. I could put them here for a halfway lift. I call this the skyscraper position because they're in their tallest height. I could make them even taller by stacking. You just want to make sure that if you're putting a lot of weight on them, that they're firm, that they're not gonna tip over, right? They could look like this. They could look like this. So we're splitting the difference here for our halfway lift, bringing the floor a little bit closer so we're not all the way up on the shins. Finally, you could just tent the fingers. Notice how my knees are bent, right? So if you remember in the very beginning when I talked about pelvic tilt, if you're having trouble tilting the pelvis, bend the knees. So here you see me doing that, because if I straighten my knees, I suddenly have a posterior tilt in my pelvis, which won't hurt me today, but if I do it frequently over time, I could hurt myself. Fourth and final tip is that it's great to make sure that the hands have contact with something, whether that's the floor, the shins, or some blocks, or something else, rather than allowing the hands to dangle in midair. So to make sure you have contact with something, it's related to using all of these props. So if I have my hands on my thighs or on my knees or on my shins, I'm pressing into my body to help me retract my shoulders and engage here. So I'm really super engaged when I'm kind of closing the chain of energy by putting my hands on something. I mentioned this tip as the final tip because I do see halfway lifts in classes that look like this. I do see halfway lifts where the hands are just hanging in the air. I could press down into the blocks, right? And I'm energetically drawing my shoulder blades together and also letting them kind of slide towards my hips. Yeah. The least amount of contact is when the fingers are tented. So my fingertips are geckoing on the floor. That's totally fine. But you still want that contact. And then I'm energetically dragging my fingertips towards my feet. That gives my shoulder blades the sense of gliding towards my hips, reaching my sternum forward, and really lengthening out my spine. So this closing of the chain allows us to really direct our energy. So you hear me talking about dragging the hands, pressing down and back, and that pressing down effectively lifts my spine, and pulling back allows my shoulder blades to kind of come down from my ears and towards my hips. Thank you so much for joining me. If you learned something, let me know by commenting below. I love to hear from you. To practice yoga with me, click the link in the description below. I've included a 45-minute core flow vinyasa class that I think you will love. You can access it absolutely free. See you next week for more yoga deep dives.